Hello, this is HQ Cap back with another Warbits video. Today we're doing a units tier list. We do the same setup as last time. We got platinum, gold, silver, bronze, and then the purple unranked unusable tier. We're starting out with the gunner. That's a unit that costs 7,000. It has a movement of 6. It has an armor of 1, and it's really strong versus infantry and air units. It can one-shot the 0 armor infantry units like the ranger and the light infantry as long as they're on a 2 defense square or less. One-shots every air unit in the game, so it's really strong and has a lot of use as infantry are really prevalent in Warbits. There's not a lot of powers that boost the gunner that much. There's certainly some movement boosting powers like the power that ignores terrain. There's the blitz power, which gives it +2 movement. For damage, though, there's not a lot of increase, as it already one-shots most of the units you're going to use it against. So it one-shots air units, so the mech booster power doesn't really affect it there. It one-shots most infantry units, so mech booster power is really only good if you're going up against heavy infantry. And so the gunner itself is just a standard, good, strong unit without much buffs outside of itself. You can pair it with a carrier. We'll talk about that later, but it's a silver tier unit, good, strong unit. You'll see it in most games. It's generally a wise idea to build one, especially on maps that have airports, as your opponent's going to be building transports, and having some gunners around to be able to one-shot those dropships is a great way to deal with them. All right, next up is the Ranger. The Ranger is a 3,000 cost infantry unit. It has a movement of 3. It has a range of 2 to 3, which then gets buff +1 on mountains, so up to range 2 to 4. It is really strong versus infantry, has a solid attack versus air units. It can even do some chipping damage on vehicles. And as it is, it's pretty good, right? Cheap range unit, can capture buildings, and just standardly fairly good for its cost because it's cheap. When you consider the powers that it gets buffed from, like the range booster, which increases its range by 1 and it buffs its damage, then it can really be a strong threat versus air units, decimate infantry, and deal okay damage versus mech units. So that makes it just an all-around good unit. And then add on the headshot ability, which allows it to one-shot any infantry unit it shoots, no matter what health it's at. So the ranger could be at 1 health, shooting at a 10 HP heavy infantry, ranger will one-shot it. And because infantry are so prevalent in this game, that makes rangers a platinum tier unit. One of the best units in the game. They're super valuable, especially on maps that have mountains. There's one map in Warbits that I'm not a huge fan of, but it can still be fun to play, that is just full of mountains in the middle. And that map is just a ranger spam map, because rangers with the headshot ability, with the range booster ability, will dominate. Next up, the light infantry. Similar to the ranger, movement of 3, no armor. This costs 1,500. And so it's a gold tier unit. It's your standard unit that you're going to start with. Having a few around is okay. You're not going to build them too much in the late game, as the ranger and other infantry options are better. But it is just a good unit to have around to run up and capture things. It can even block areas off if you need a cheap unit to like throw in the way to guard another unit. Again, the infantry booster power. Should have talked about this with the ranger, but the infantry booster power is another power that buffs the ranger and, of course, the light infantry. And so getting captures off can really put pressure on your opponent, and this unit is just all around good and is the cheapest unit in the game, so it deserves a gold tier. Not quite, definitely not a platinum tier, but just ekes out silver tier. Next up is the Ballista. This is the most expensive ground unit in the game. It costs 15,000, and it's a range unit, so it has a range of 3 to 5, so 1 to 2 squares away from itself it cannot shoot. It has a lot of damage versus mechs, a lot of damage versus infantry, cannot attack air. And so this unit also has no armor, so if you get anything up close to hit it, it's going to take a lot of damage, even from weak units. So it's a silver tier unit. It's a unit that, if a game goes on long enough, gets to the very late game, you should be building these. They're great units for closing out a game. Again, pairing these units with carriers is really important in late game situations, as you can hover in your backline and get huge value out of these guys. As if they're in a carrier in your backline, there's not a lot of ways for your opponent to get to them, and they're going to stay alive, while cheaper units, like your infantry, die in the front, or transport units block for them. So that's what makes the Ballista a silver tier unit despite that high price. The other thing that makes it a silver tier, or solidifies its silver tier placement, is that it has a big buff from that range booster. That 3 to 5 range now becomes 3 to 6. It has increased damage, so now can deal a lot more damage and start one-shotting some units in certain cases. And because it's a expensive unit, if it does take some damage, you get a high value return from putting it on a city to repair. So as long as you can keep it alive, even if it takes damage, you're going to get huge value by repairing it up. All right, the next unit's the jet. So the jet costs 18,500 funds, and it has a high move, high visibility. It's, can see far, move far. It has I think the highest movement in the game with a movement of 7. I should have said the Ballista only has a movement of 4, which really doesn't matter, as you're going to be pairing with a carrier or just keeping it in the back line. But just the fastest unit in the game, does great versus air units. One-shots all air units in the game, which you would think makes it really good. However, I'm going to put it in the unusable category. This might be being a bit too harsh, but I feel like there's other things that just do its job better. There's cheaper, better options over the jet. There are a few situations where I've built jets, but I don't think any of the situations that I've built jets in, I very, very few of them warranted me building jets. There's other units I could have built. And so there's probably only one map in the game that I can think of where building a jet might be okay, and that's on the map with a lake in the middle, where there's no ground tiles around it, just ground tiles to the north and south. But the jet is expensive. It does the same job as the gunner, but it costs more than a gunner and a carrier. So a gunner and a carrier costs 17,000. Jet costs 18,500. The jet does get some buffs from the air booster, as it gets a +2 movement range. But if you think about it, the carrier moves 6. We'll talk about the carrier. We'll bump up the carrier next, just so we can start talking about it. The carrier has movement of 6. The gunner has a movement of 6. That's a 12-inch move. The jet move of 7 is great, and the buff with 2 from the power is great, but the gunner and the carrier combination are just better. And we'll even talk about other anti-air combos in the game that are just as good or better than that one. The other thing is that Rangers also deal a lot of damage versus air units, and because of the range booster, plus the fact that Rangers can be in dropships to fly around, really lets you have a lot of anti-air potential from Rangers too. So there's a lot of other anti-air options that are cheaper and better. The jet cannot attack ground units, so you're only using it to take down air units, and because air units in Warbits are generally weak, the jet's therefore weak. All right, next up is the carrier. The carrier costs 10,000, has a movement of 6, can store 2 units, including mech units. The carrier is great late game. If you build it too early, you will be punished, just like the Ballista. If you build it too early, you won't have enough defensive units for it. But the carrier is a gold tier unit. The versatility that it gives you, being able to transport mech units, just makes for some insane range. As I talked about, the gunner and a carrier can now move 12 inches technically. Actually more than that. Because you move 6 with the carrier, drop the gunner, that counts as a space. and then the gunner can move an additional 6. So it's more like 13 range. The carrier can get your gunner over rivers, get mechs over rivers, or the other option, put range units in it, like the Ballista, like an anti-air. Keep them in your back line, keep the carrier safe, keep those expensive range units safe, and just pepper your opponent, pick off units that you want while having a screen of cheaper units. And eventually that value is going to pay for itself, and your opponent's either going to have to transition to their own carrier and range unit, or they're just going to lose the game. So that's why the carrier is gold tier. It also, if you have infantry laying around, you can pop 2 infantry in there. The carrier is only twice the cost of a dropship, so theoretically using it to transport 2 infantry units is fine. I think if you're going to build a carrier, you really should be using it to transport mech units, but tossing an infantry or 2 in there is okay too if the opportunity arises. The other thing is that if you have 2 damaged mech units, toss them both in the carrier, pop the carrier on a city, they'll heal twice. So each mech will heal. I haven't tested that recently, but I'm pretty sure that's how it works. So if you have some frontline, maybe a light mech or a gunner that's done some damage but now has taken some, pop them back into the carrier, retreat, heal up, go forward. So that's why carrier is gold tier, and that's going to be, I'm going to put that ahead of the infantry. Next up is the APC. This unit is extremely common. It's the basic transport unit for infantry. It heals units with the medic ability by 3, and it supplies units. So the medic ability is just one of the abilities that buffs the APC, lets it drive up to units and heal them by 3 when it supplies units. The other thing it also benefits from, and the carrier actually benefits from, is the Guardian ability, which makes it immune to damage. So you can get some APC walls like surround an HQ, park it on a factory, various things that you can do to be annoying to your opponents. Basically put this invincible wall up for 1 turn. So the APC is going to be gold tier. The reason it's gold tier is just its ability to transport infantry units around, make infantry units that much better, put them in places your opponent didn't expect, get those slow-moving heavy mechs to the front. And so the APC is one of the core units, and you should be building this unit every game. There's no reason not to have one around. The other powers that kind of benefit the APC would be the movement boosting powers. Sometimes the APC will benefit from those, but most of the time your focus on the APC is just moving your infantry around and supplying your other units. All right, next up is the APC costs 4,000, so it's the cheapest transport unit in the game. It has an armor of 2, so it's a really strong unit in terms of armor and its ability to block enemy forces. Gunship's up next. It costs 10,000, has a movement of 6, does decent damage versus infantry, okay damage versus mechs, okay damage versus air units. And just because of its cost, it's a B tier. The air booster helps it out a little bit, gives it a little bit of a buff to damage, buffs its movement. But really there's better options, as this costs the same amount as a carrier, and the carrier is going to give you more value over the long term as long as you keep it alive. A gunner often is used to move forward, deal some damage, pick off a unit, but then it's going to get countered pretty quickly by either a gunner or other anti-air units like a ranger that'll take it down pretty easily. Even infantry, heavy infantry, can deal some significant damage versus dropships or the gunship. So that's why it's a bronze tier. It's okay to build in situations, limited situations, but it's not a unit that you want to be building in most of your games. It's a unit to avoid, but in some situations it's arguable that it's okay to build. Next up is the anti-air. This guy, actually forget the cost of this guy. I think he costs 12,000, 3,000. Let's look him up. Let's figure out what he costs. All right, got that back. The anti-air costs 12,000, and so it's a reasonably costed unit for what it does. It again has the same range as the Ballista, 3 to 5. So it'll benefit greatly from a range booster power. Let you target air units, kill them in one shot. The only reason to build this guy, in my opinion, is if you're going to pair it with a transport like the carrier. Otherwise, you're going to have to kind of move it with your lines up too far. It might get targeted, or just your opponent can dance around with their air units and keep it out of range. So this guy needs to be paired with a carrier. And so I'm going to give it a bronze tier. It's probably better than all the other bronze units, but because air units in general aren't that strong, and because most of the time you'll have other anti-air units, aka the gunner and the ranger, to deal with your opponent's air units, it's not a unit that you build every game. It's a niche unit that can be used really effectively. So like I said, if you pair it with a carrier, you can unload it, target an enemy carrier, one-shot that carrier, and if there's units in your opponent's carrier that they're probably going to be fairly valuable mech units, then you're going to get a huge amount of value out of these guys. So they can be insane and will win you a game. I've won at least 1 or 2 games just because I did that combo, but in most games I'm not building them. In most games I'm relying on the gunner and other units to be my anti-air. But they are fun units to use, and when it gets that super late game, stalemate-y kind of lines are drawn across the river or across the map, kind of stalemate situation, they're pretty valuable. Next up is the heavy infantry. This is the best unit in the game and has a movement of 2. Can move across mountains unimpeded. Has good damage, great damage versus vehicles, good damage versus infantry, good damage versus air units. It's cheap. It only costs 2,500. It benefits greatly from the heavy bullets power, just like I should have gone over that with the ranger. The heavy bullets also affects the ranger and the light infantry. The ranger and the heavy infantry are the ones that benefit most. The ranger because it targets, air units really well and decimates infantry. The heavy infantry because it decimates pretty much everything on the map except air units with that heavy bullets power active. The heavy infantry paired with a transport is your kind of standard building block to any army. You should always be building heavy infantry no matter what game map you're in. Heavy infantry with transports is just the basic building block of your army. Without them, you're really leaving a lot of value on the table, and you're going to be spending more for expensive units that do less. So if you think about it, a APC with a heavy infantry costs 6,500, and the gunner and the light mech cost 7,000. The heavy infantry in the APC has a higher movement than both those units, so it has a movement of 7. The 6 plus the drop space plus the 2 movement of the heavy infantry just makes it have a better movement. They do about the same damage as light mechs. Light mechs do a little more in some certain circumstances, but then you add on the heavy bullets power, and then you really realize how much damage these guys do. So heavy infantry, best unit in the game. Platinum tier. Next up is the artillery. This costs 6,500. It has a range just like the ranger of 2 to 3. It actually has an armor of 1, so that 1 armor does help it out, helps it survive a little more than the ballista. And so this guy can kind of be, it's your standard range unit if you're progressing. It does more damage than the ranger. It has more armor and more defense than the ranger, so this is a good solid unit to go for if you plan on using the range booster power, as it does a lot of damage versus infantry, good damage versus mechs, and so it's a standard building block for a game in which you want to use the range booster power. So it's going to be a silver tier. Put it ahead of the ballista because the ballista's more expensive, and most games you don't reach that super late game stage. So the artillery is a solid unit. You'll see these in a fair number of games. It depends on the map. If the map has a lot of choke points, you really probably should build yourself a artillery, as you can chop down some of the walls your opponent will try to put up with the beefier like APCs or mech units. And next up's the heavy mech. This costs 14,000. It has a armor of 4, which is the highest armor in the game. Has a movement of 5, which is okay, And it does great damage versus infantry, versus mechs, and okay damage versus air units. It's going to be a bronze tier just because of its cost. Now, there's some cases, this unit, has some cases where it's good. But most of the time, I would argue that a Ballista is better. If you're in that late game situation, it's better and safer to build a Ballista, as you can kind of guard that unit and protect it, whereas a heavy mech is going to be pushing forward, dealing a ton of damage, but then it has to defend itself. And despite having 4 armor, it still takes a decent amount of damage from heavy infantry. And if your opponent is in that heavy bullets range, he can still take out a heavy mech pretty easily. You can't one-shot it, but it can take it out. It's a good option later in the game, arguably, because it can retreat and heal up, and you're getting a ton of value out of it as you're punching forward with your first attack. You're taking some damage when they counterattack, but you're still dealing damage back as it has that armor. It's going to maintain its health. And then you can pull it back to heal, getting incredible value as it is an expensive unit. Those points of healing are extremely good for the value of time, as you're healing quite a bit of money back, and then you're ready to punch forward again. So it can be used that way, but I would argue the Ballista is better. Some situations, it is a good unit to build. Next up is the probe. The probe I'm going to put in bronze tier. It has movement of 6. It can fly over rivers or the sea, one space of sea tiles. It has okay damage versus infantry, but other than that, it's kind of useless. It doesn't deal a lot of damage versus air. Versus mechs, it's pretty much worthless. It's like a light infantry. It's only really good for scouting and early game harassment. If you build more than 2 of these on a map, I want to say you made a mistake. I think I've built, 1 occasionally here or there. On the coin flip map, I talked about why they're okay to build. Situational units, again, if you build 2 of them, I think that's probably too much. As you're investing, these guys cost 3,500 when a heavy infantry costs 2,500. Sorry if I said the costs wrong earlier. The alpha is changing some of the costs, but the heavy infantry is 2,500. The probe is 3,500, and so the heavy infantry just runs up and punches the probe in the face, and the probe's pretty much done for the rest of the game unless it goes back and heals for like 3 turns. So probes are okay to get 1 out, harass, scout, and then keep it back to use sparingly. So it doesn't have any powers that it really benefits from. The mech booster doesn't do a lot for it. It's not dealing a lot of damage. So that's why it's a bronze tier. Okay to build 1, but I wouldn't build any more than that. Next up is the dropship. Costs 5,000 and is a gold tier unit. Same reason as the other transports. It is a great unit for transporting infantry. It's going to be one of the core units if you have an airport on the field. You should be building transports that let you capture faster. It'll let you deal damage with your heavy infantry and rangers better. And you can even use it to block a little bit. It's not as good of a blocker as the APC once your opponent gets gunners out. Without gunners on the field, it's a great blocker, but once gunners hit the table, these guys will die. So you actually want to keep these guys kind of back and push forward with the APCs and block with your APCs. But it's a gold tier unit. Being able to fly over terrain is extremely valuable to get your infantry behind enemy lines, kill their more fragile units, get on top of things that your opponent is trying to defend. Next up, the mech, or the light mech. So the light mech costs 7,000, just like the gunner, movement of 6. Has an armor of 2, which is good. And it benefits pretty well from the mech booster power, as it does decent damage versus infantry, good damage versus other mechs, and okay damage versus air units. Any unit it attacks, it'll get some benefit out of that mech boosting power. It has that 2 armor, so it'll be able to survive a heavy bullets attack from a full HP heavy infantry as long as it's on a plains tile or higher defense. So plains, forests, cities, it'll survive a full HP heavy infantry attacking, which is important, as if you're looking to block areas of the map off, this guy can can be very valuable along with an APC to kind of stop a chain push from your opponent if they have a heavy bullets attack. Its ability to punch through APC lines is also important, as it can deal about 50% of the damage to an APC depending on what terrain it's on. So mechs can help chew through your opponent's kind of blocky APC walls a little better than the heavy infantry, which only deal about 40% damage. So there are good reasons to build them. I think building them is arguably good. Normally I go for the heavy infantry APC combo, but getting a couple, maybe one or two light mechs out is good. You've seen them in my games. So the light mechs, the gunners, the artillery, I would say are pretty standard units to see on a battlefield in terms of mechs. All right, last up is the bomber. The bomber is trash. Bomber is the worst unit in the game. It costs 20,000, so the most expensive. It one-shots just about all ground units that it comes across, but it can't attack air and it can't retaliate. So you run it forward, you kill what you wanted to kill, and then it just takes a whole bunch of damage from what's ever left. And spending 20,000 on a unit that can't retaliate is bad. It's just bad. And considering the other combinations that you could pull off instead of the bomber, it really shows how worthless it is. So you could build a carrier and a light mech. You could build a carrier and a gunner. You could build a carrier, a gunner, and a ranger, or a carrier, light mech, and a heavy infantry. There's all these other combinations that you get 3 units for the price of 1 that do a better job because they can counterattack and they have powers that buff them. The only power that buffs this guy is really the air booster, but you're one-shotting everything, so the attack damage buff doesn't do much. It's all about the movement range, which is good. Having +2 movement is great, but you're just throwing it further forward where it's going to die. So you're basically losing 20,000 funds when you build this unit. The only reason to build this unit is to close out a game that you have way too much money on. So that's the unit tier list. We'll just run it through, make sure all these are the right order. So the heavy infantry is definitely the best of the game, benefits from multiple powers, infantry booster, heavy bullets. It's got a lot going for it, can capture. Same with the ranger. Not quite as good, but up there with the multiple powers it benefits from, it being cheap. The transport units are all gold tier for the various reasons. They just work so well with any unit they're transporting. Infantry units, just the standard unit, and deserves a gold tier, the light infantry. And then the silver tier is going to be, so yeah, platinum's the best units. Gold, you have your units that you should be building just about every game. If you get to the point where you can build the carriers, of course, but these 3 units, the APC, dropship, light infantry, you're going to be building those every game. Silver tier is the units you'll generally see every game, and building them is a good idea. Again, with the asterisk next to Ballista, you need to get into a late game scenario, but any game that gets that late game scenario, you should be building Ballista. Bronze tier is the kind of situational units. The probe is probably the highest on that tier, as you can get away with building 1 per game, and that's probably okay. So if you play that playstyle, it's probably silver tier, but I'm putting it at bronze. The heavy mech is also bronze tier, situationally good. Anti-air, situationally good. Situationally actually extremely powerful, but rare. And the gunship, extremely situational. Generally don't build this unit. And the unusable units, the port jet does a good job of what it does. It's just air units aren't that great, and there's other units available that do a similar job. And the bomber, which is not good. So that's my unit overview. My next video is going to be a fundamentals of Warbits, or kind of like beginner advice kind of video. And so this will be good reference or good intro for that, as I'll be talking about kind of your strategy overall in Warbits, what the ideas of what units you should be building, and this kind of gives you an overview of what units I think players should be using. Basically, silver tier up are good units to consider, and you have the bronze tier, which is situational. But that's it for me. I'll see you guys around, and have fun playing more Warbits.